Well, well, look at you, still breathing, still moving through your days with that unshakable composure that refuses to bow, refuses to tremble, refuses to dim. No matter how many sideways glances or whispered narratives tried to stick to your name, they thought pressure would make you fold. They thought repetition would turn rumor into truth. They thought if enough voices spoke at once, reality would eventually follow the noise. They were wrong. They called people in one by one, old acquaintances, former rivals, individuals who once believed they understood you well enough to define you. Each of them carried a version of the story slightly different, slightly exaggerated, polished to sound convincing. They expected alignment. They expected confirmation. They expected a clean narrative to emerge from repetition. But something unexpected happened. The stories didn't line up. Not cleanly. Not naturally. Each retelling bent a little too far in one direction. Each explanation needed too much effort, too many emotional spikes, too much performance. And slowly, quietly, the room began to notice the difference between what was being said and what had actually been seen. Because while they were busy explaining you, you were busy being consistent. You didn't rush to clarify. You didn't jump into debates. You didn't issue dramatic statements or demand understanding. You stayed where you were, steady, composed, unchanged. And that music, steadiness became impossible to ignore. People started comparing notes, not because you asked them to, but because something felt off. The accusations were loud. Your behavior was calm. The contrast did the work for you. This is where narratives start to collapse. Not with confrontation, but with comparison. Someone noticed that every claim about you relied on emotion, not evidence. Someone else noticed that the people speaking the loudest were also the ones shifting their story the most. Another noticed that while others were reacting in spikes and surges, you were moving at the same pace you always had. No urgency, no panic, no sudden reinvention. Consistency has a way of exposing instability without saying a word. They tried to frame your calm as indifference that didn't hold. They tried to label it avoidance. That didn't fit either because you weren't disappearing. You were present, observable, measurable. The same tone, the same posture, the same rhythm day after day. And eventually, people stopped asking what was being said about you and started asking why it didn't match what they were seeing. That's when doubt crept in, not toward you, but toward the story built around you. You see, false narratives survive on momentum. They need constant feeding. They need outrage, reaction, reinforcement, music. And you gave them none of it. You didn't fuel the fire because you weren't standing in it. You let it burn itself out on thin air. And as it did, the ones who started it grew louder, sharper, more erratic. Overreaction became their tell. Meanwhile, you remain readable in the simplest way possible. Not transparent, just consistent. There's a moment when observers stop listening to words and start watching patterns. That moment doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives with silence. People begin to notice how often certain names appear only in chaos, and how others appear unchanged, no matter the environment. They notice who escalates and who stabilizes, who reacts and who regulates. That's when reality begins to correct itself. Someone mentioned Elon Musk in passing, not as a comparison, not as a shield, but as an example, a name so visible that it can't hide behind narrative, a reminder that scale doesn't come from noise alone. That credibility isn't built on explanation, but on alignment between action and outcome. When a name carries weight, People stop asking how loud the story is and start asking how accurate it is. That mention lingered not because it elevated you, but because it reframed the conversation. It reminded people that reputation isn't sustained by performance. It's sustained by coherence over time. And suddenly your silence didn't look like absence. It looked like confidence without display. The people who once tried to corner you began hesitating, not because you pushed back, but because their own certainty started wobbling. They reread messages, replayed conversations, compared timelines, and each time they did, the same problem surfaced. You hadn't changed. The story had accusations need escalation to survive. Integrity doesn't. You watched it happen without stepping in. You let people arrive at their own conclusions. One by one, support formed. Not loudly, not publicly, but steadily. Someone defended you without being asked. Someone else questioned the narrative out loud. Another simply stopped engaging with the noise altogether. None of it traced back to you directly. Music, and that's what made it credible. Truth doesn't recruit. It resonates. The more others tried to force a conclusion, the more their own contradictions surfaced. Dates didn't match. Motives shifted. Emotions ran hot where facts should have been cool. And the audience, the quiet observers who mattered most, began stepping back from the spectacle. They weren't impressed by intensity anymore. They were drawn to stability, and you were still there. Same presence, same restraint, same grounded pace. What unsettled them wasn't that you were winning. It was that you weren't playing. You didn't treat this like a battlefield. You treated it like weather, something that passes when it has no structure to hold it in place. You trusted time to do what force never could, and time listened. The narrative lost its grip, not because it was challenged, but because it became unnecessary. People moved on, not away from you, away from the noise. The ones who built their relevance on exaggeration found themselves without an audience. The ones who relied on reaction found nothing left to provoke. You didn't step forward to claim vindication. You didn't mark music the moment. You just continued. And in that continuation, something important became clear. Reality doesn't reward the loudest voice. It rewards the most consistent signal. This isn't the end of the story. Not yet. Because the full realization, the quiet understanding of what actually happened, hasn't fully settled in. There are still conversations replaying, still moments of recalculation happening behind closed doors, still people realizing a little too late that they misread the situation. And you're still moving the same way you always have, unrushed, unshaken, letting the rest catch up. And while all of this unfolded, you never announced a turning point. You didn't mark a victory. You didn't even acknowledge the shift. That's what made it unsettling for them. Most people need a moment where they can say, "This is where I prove myself." You didn't. You let the moment pass like it was always supposed to. Behind the scenes, people started asking quieter questions. Not the dramatic kind, the uncomfortable ones. Why did the story need so much effort to sustain itself? Why did it keep changing shape? Why did every retelling sound more emotional than factual? And why, through all of it, did you look exactly the same? That's when observation replaced opinion. People stopped listening to who felt the strongest about you and started watching who stayed consistent around you. They noticed how conversations changed tone when your name came up, how the ones who exaggerated the most also seemed the least grounded, how the ones who had actually interacted with you. Music spoke carefully, without urgency, without drama. Care is a test, so is restraint. You weren't trying to be mysterious. You weren't cultivating distance. You were simply refusing to perform. And in a world that confuses performance with power, that refusal became the loudest signal in the room. Time did what time always does. It separated reaction from reality. The louder voices began circling back on themselves, repeating points that no longer landed. Their confidence thinned, their certainty fractured. Each attempt to reinforce the narrative required more force than the last. That's the thing about exaggeration. It demands escalation. Calm doesn't. Calm just waits, and you waited without waiting. You kept living your life, showing up the same way, making the same decisions, holding the same standards, not to prove anything, but because that's who you are when no one is watching. And people could feel the difference between someone holding a position and someone holding a posture. Somewhere along the way, the comparison became unavoidable, not because anyone set it up, but because it emerged naturally. On one side, there was noise, volatile, reactive, constantly updating its own story. On the other side, there was you, steady, predictable in the best way, unmoved by the weather around you. That's when someone said it out loud. This doesn't add up. Not as an accusation, as an observation. Once that sentence enters the room, everything changes. Because now people aren't choosing sides, they're choosing coherence. They're choosing the version of events that requires the least distortion to believe. You never asked anyone to defend you, and yet defense formed quietly, independently. Someone corrected a detail in a conversation you weren't part of. Someone else questioned a claim without raising their voice. Another simply said, "That hasn't been my experience," and let the silence do the rest. Truth spreads like that, not in waves, in ripples. It reminded people of something they don't like to admit. Credibility isn't built by how aggressively music you speak, but by how little you need to explain. The more someone talks about their integrity, the more people start checking for it. You didn't talk about yours at all. There was a moment, subtle, almost unnoticeable, when the narrative stopped moving forward. Music, it didn't collapse dramatically. It stalled. It lost momentum. People stopped sharing it, stopped reacting to it, stopped finding it interesting. And without attention, it couldn't survive. What replaced it wasn't applause for you. It was recalibration. People began reassessing their own assumptions, not just about you, but about how easily they had accepted a story that required emotional investment, but offered no stability. Music. They noticed how quickly they had leaned toward intensity instead of accuracy. How familiar that pattern felt. How often they'd seen it before. Your role in all of this remained unchanged. You didn't step into the vacuum, you didn't claim space, you let the absence of noise speak for itself. At some point, someone referenced Elon Musk again, not as a comparison of status, but as a reminder of scale, of what happens when visibility, music meets consistency, of how at a certain level, stories either align with reality or collapse under their own weight. Big names don't survive on reaction. They survive on alignment over time. That reference didn't elevate you. It grounded the conversation. People realized this wasn't about defending you. It was about recognizing a pattern they'd seen before. When integrity doesn't respond, distortion eventually runs out of material. You weren't untouchable. You were simply not participating in the game that was trying to touch you. And that distinction mattered. Those who once tried to corner you now found themselves cornered by their own words, not publicly, internally. They replayed conversations, reread messages, not because you forced accountability, but because something about the outcome didn't sit right. They had expected resistance. They had prepared for conflict. Instead, they were left alone with their own overstatements. Silence can do that. It removes the distraction. You became a reference point without intending to be one. Not because you were central, but because you were stable. When people talked about what actually happened, your behavior became the control variable, the one thing that didn't fluctuate. And in analysis, that's everything. No one announced that the story was wrong. It simply stopped being useful. Support didn't arrive in the form of crowds or declarations. It arrived as alignment, as people choosing not to engage with exaggeration, as conversations shifting away from speculation and back toward observable behavior, as respect returning without being requested. Music. And still, you didn't change pace. That's the part they still struggle with, that you didn't need this moment. You didn't need redemption or recognition. You weren't waiting for the narrative to clear so you could move forward. You had never stopped moving forward. The pressure that was supposed to define you ended up defining them instead. Their urgency exposed their insecurity. Their insistence exposed their lack of grounding. And your restraint exposed nothing, because there was nothing to expose. Music, this isn't about winning. It never was. It's about coherence outlasting chaos. About integrity being heavier than accusation. About time favoring what doesn't need correction. And as this continues, because it's still continuing, you remain where you've always been. Not above it, not outside it, just steady within it, letting reality finish the work it already started. The full understanding hasn't landed yet. It's still forming, still settling into place. And you're not waiting for it. You're just being you. And that, as it turns out, is more than enough to let the rest unravel on its own. By the time it fully settles, there's no announcement, no apology tour, no dramatic reversal. Music, just a quiet understanding spreading from one person to the next, the way truth usually does when it doesn't need help. People start realizing that the story didn't end because you won. It ended because it couldn't survive scrutiny anymore. It required too much emotion to stay upright, too many explanations, too many edits, and eventually, people got tired of carrying it. You never asked them to stop. You never corrected them publicly. Music, you never demanded clarity. You let the weight of inconsistency do the work for you. And that's when the real shift happened. Not outside of you, but inside the room. Conversations changed, not about you directly, but about trust, about credibility, about how easily people confuse intensity for truth, about how often the loudest voice ends up being the least accurate. Your situation became a reference point, not because you insisted on it, but because it revealed something uncomfortable about how narratives are formed. Some people felt embarrassed, others felt exposed. A few felt relieved because deep down they had sensed the exaggeration early on, but didn't know how to name it without becoming a target themselves. Your calm gave them permission to slow down, to observe, to think. You didn't become louder when the pressure rose. You became quieter, more precise, more consistent. And consistency over time is undeniable. It doesn't argue, it accumulates. That's the part no one teaches you. Integrity doesn't need defense, it needs time. As the noise faded, what remained was behavior, yours, the same as it had always been. That's when people finally saw it clearly. Nothing about you required distortion to make sense, and everything about the accusations required it to survive. The ones who had leaned hardest into the story started pulling back first. Not because they were confronted, but because they felt the ground shifting beneath their certainty. When a narrative stops being echoed, it starts sounding strange even to the people who created it. Others followed quietly, one by one. Support didn't show up as loyalty, it showed up as discernment, as people choosing not to repeat things they couldn't verify, as pauses in conversations where drama used to rush in as a collective exhale. You noticed it, of course, but you didn't react to that either. You kept moving the same way, living the same way, holding the same internal line, because your life was never organized around correcting perception. It was organized around being aligned with yourself. That alignment is what carried you through. Not resilience in the dramatic sense, but coherence. You didn't fragment under pressure. You didn't split into who you are and who you needed to appear to be. You stayed whole, and wholeness is disarming. Eventually, even the most skeptical observers reach the same conclusion, not emotionally, but logically. If the claims were true, the behavior wouldn't look like this. If the character was flawed, music, the consistency wouldn't hold. If the story had substance, it wouldn't need reinforcement. Reality corrected the distortion the only way it ever does, slowly, invisibly, completely. There's no satisfaction in that moment, no urge to say, "I told you so." Because by the time it's obvious, it's also irrelevant. You're already elsewhere mentally, already past the need for recognition. What remains is quieter than victory. It's respect without ceremony, space without explanation, a recalibration you didn't ask for, but don't resist. People don't look at you the same way anymore, not because you demanded it, but because they can't unsee what consistency looks like under pressure. You become a reminder, whether you want to be or not, that truth doesn't. Music need urgency. That calm is not weakness. That silence can be evidence. And through all of it, you're unchanged, still grounded, still observant, still uninterested in proving anything to anyone who wasn't paying attention in the first place. That's the final turn they never expected. Not that the story would flip, but that it would simply dissolve, and you would walk forward untouched by the noise that once tried to define you, carrying nothing but the quiet certainty that you didn't need to fight to be understood. You just needed to stay real long enough for reality to catch up. Something about you does not add up. Nah. And I mean that in the most disorienting, wonderful, completely inexplicable way possible. Because people look at you and they do the math, and the math does not work. They run the numbers. The way you move, the way your skin holds light, the energy you carry into a room, the particular quality of your presence, they run all of it, and they arrive at a number that does not match what they are standing in front of. They look again, still does not add up. And the confusion on their face, that specific, slightly embarrassed confusion of someone whose confident assessment has just been quietly dismantled by evidence. That is one of the most honest reactions you will ever receive from another human being. Because they were not trying to be surprised. They came in with a framework. They thought they knew how to read what they were seeing. And then something about you, something that does not announce itself, does not perform itself, does not ask for acknowledgement, simply refused to fit the framework. And they stood there recalculating. Tick-tock, tick-tock, let me tell you what they are actually seeing, because this is important. Not for vanity, not for the shallow pleasure of knowing you have confused someone's expectations, but because understanding what produces this effect in people is understanding something profound about the relationship between how you have lived and what your living has written on you. Understanding this is understanding something about the reward system of a life built on certain foundations rather than others. Something about what time does to a person depending entirely on what that person does with time. Because here is the truth that the world does not discuss with nearly enough seriousness. Time is not neutral. Time is not a single experience that happens to everyone the same way, producing the same results at the same rate with the same effect on the face and the body and the energy of the person moving through it. Time is a revealer, a writer, a sculptor of sorts, and what it sculpts depends entirely on the material it is working with and the conditions under which the work is being done. And the material it has been working within you, the interior conditions, the daily choices, the orientation of your spirit, the things you have been feeding and the things you have been releasing. That material has been responding to time differently than most. No. This is not accident. This is not luck. This is not the random genetic fortune of someone who happened to inherit favorable circumstances and is simply coasting on an inheritance they did nothing to earn. What you carry, this glow, this quality, this thing that makes people's math stop working when they try to calculate you. This was produced by a specific way of moving through the world that has left a specific kind of mark, and I want to tell you what that something is. The glow is not a surface phenomenon, and this is where most conversations about this kind of thing go wrong. They stay on the surface. They talk about skincare and water intake and sleep and the physical disciplines that contribute to physical appearance, and those things are real. They matter. They have genuine effect, and if you practice them, you should feel good about that practice. But they are not the source of what people are responding to when they look at you and find that their framework stops working. The source is deeper. The source is the quality of your inner life, and what that quality accumulated over years, practiced in private, chosen daily in ways that have no immediate audience and no immediate reward. What that quality eventually does to the exterior of a person who has been committed to it long enough. Think about what stress does to a face, not in the abstract, concretely, visibly, measurably. The particular tightness that comes from chronic anxiety. The lines that are not the beautiful lines of a life fully lived, but the carved tracks of a mind that never stops running. Worst case scenarios. The dullness that settles into the eyes of someone who has been carrying resentment long enough that the carrying has become invisible to them. They no longer notice the weight because the weight has simply become their normal. The particular quality of someone who has been at war with themselves for so long that the war is now written permanently in the set of their jaw and the tension in their shoulders and the guardedness that lives just behind their smile. Time writes all of that accurately and without mercy. But time also writes the other thing that happens to a person who has been not perfectly, not without struggle, not without seasons of genuine difficulty and real pain and the particular exhaustion of being a human being in a world that does not make it easy. But fundamentally at the level of daily orientation, at the level of what they return to when the difficulty passes, committed to peace, to gratitude, to releasing what cannot be carried. To finding the thing worth appreciating in the situation before cataloging the things worth resenting, to processing pain rather than storing it, to forgiving not for the other person, not as a performance of virtue, but as the deeply practical act of a person who understands that unforgiveness is acid that damages its container first. Time writes that too, and what time writes on a person who has been living that way is not a line-by-line account of every difficulty survived. It is something closer to light, a particular quality of settled energy, a face that has been through things but has not been hardened by things, eyes that carry depth without carrying damage, a presence that feels. And this is the word people reach for most often, even when they cannot fully explain it. Alive, genuinely, fully, quietly alive in a way that a lot of faces, for all their surface perfection, simply do not. And the age thing, the specific confusion people experience when their assessment of your age collides with what they are actually observing. That confusion is the most honest possible testimony to this. Because aging in the way that people expect aging to look is largely the accumulation of what has been stored, the weight of the unprocessed, the visible record of what was held too tightly and too long, the writing of chronic tension and unresolved grief, and the particular exhaustion of a person who has been performing okays over genuine okays for enough years that the performance is now showing through the performance when that accumulation does not show the way people expect it to show. It means something was not stored the way most people store it. It means something was processed, released, brought to the light and examined and handed over to something larger than the self to carry. It means seasons of difficulty were moved through rather than around, entered fully, felt completely and then genuinely left behind rather than tucked into the body to surface later as tension and guardedness and the particular aging that comes not from years but from weight. You moved through things and the moving through left a different mark than the storing would have. Now, let me talk about the glow specifically, because glow is the word people reach for and then immediately feel slightly embarrassed by because it sounds imprecise, almost mystical, resistant to the kind of concrete explanation that satisfying descriptions usually offer. But glow is actually a precise word for a real and observable phenomenon, and understanding what it actually is removes the mysticism without removing the wonder. Glow is coherence. What people are responding to when they use that word, when they look at you and reach for glow, because nothing more specific seems adequate, is the visible coherence of a person whose interior and exterior are not at war with each other. The alignment of someone who is at the most fundamental level, living in a way that matches who they actually are. Not performing a life, not maintaining a presentation that requires constant energy to sustain because the presentation and the reality beneath it are two different projects. Actually living from the inside out, from the real self outward into every expression and choice and interaction in a way that is genuinely integrated. And integration is visible not as a specific feature, as a quality of the whole, as something that registers before analysis and persists after the analytical mind has tried and failed to isolate its source, as the reason people look at you and feel something they reach for. Words like glow to describe, because the word captures the effect even if it does not fully capture the mechanism. The mechanism is alignment. The effect is light, and people are drawn to light, the way they are drawn to warmth automatically, pre-rational, without needing to decide to be drawn. Something in them simply orients. But here is what I need you to receive. Because there is a version of hearing everything I have just said that is still fundamentally passive, that receives this as something that happened to you, as a quality you were given, or that developed without your participation as a gift, rather than a result. And I need to gently but clearly refuse that framing, because the glow is not something that happened to you. It is something you chose. Accumulated choice. Accumulated choice by accumulated choice. In seasons when choosing it was not easy. In moments when the alternative, storing the bitterness, feeding the resentment, closing the heart that had been hurt and keeping it closed, was not just available but understandable, forgivable, the choice that most people would have made and that nobody would have blamed you for making. You made the other one. No, not once. Not in a single dramatic moment of noble decision. Again and again and again. In the ordinary daily moments that do not feel like choices of consequence, but that accumulate over years into the total architecture of a life and a face and a presence and a glow, you chose to release what would have hardened you. You chose to release what would have hardened you. You chose to remain open when closing would have been justified. You chose to find the gratitude in situations that presented more obvious material for grievance. You chose to trust something larger than your own understanding in seasons when your own understanding had run out of explanations. Each of those choices cost something. Each of them required something from you that the opposite choice would not have required. And the accumulation of those costs, those daily private unwitnessed payments toward a way of being that you could not have seen, was producing what it was producing. That accumulation is the glow. You built it with your choices over years, and now people are looking at you and their math is not working, and they are reaching for words like glow, because something about you is registering as extraordinary, and they cannot locate the source. And that inability to locate the source is itself part of what makes it so compelling, because the things we can fully explain do not fascinate us. It is the things that exceed our explanatory frameworks, the things that produce an effect whose source we cannot isolate, whose mechanism we cannot fully trace, whose presence we can feel clearly but cannot reduce to a formula. Those are the things that stay with us, that return to us, that make us look again. You are one of those things. Let me say one more thing. One final thing that I need you to carry with you. Not as pride, not as the kind of self-satisfaction that closes a person rather than continuing to open them, but as a responsibility. The glow is not just for you. Nah, it was never just for you. A light that is kept private illuminates nothing. A warmth that is hidden serves no one. The particular quality that time and choice and orientation have produced in you. The thing that stops people's frameworks, that makes their math fail, that sends them reaching for words like glow, because ordinary words feel insufficient. That thing has a function beyond being admired. It gives people permission. This is the deepest gift of a person who carries what you carry. Not the admiration they generate, not the confusion they produce in people's age calculations, but the permission their presence extends to everyone around them. The silent, powerful, completely unspoken permission to believe that it is possible, that a person can go through real things, genuine difficulty, real loss, actual seasons of darkness, and come out the other side. Not diminished, but luminous. Not hardened, but deepened. Not aged in the way that weight ages a person, but matured in the way that wisdom matures a face, making it more itself, more settled, more undeniably alive. You are proof that this is possible. Not as a poster, not as an inspiration account, just as a person living their actual life in a way that happens to demonstrate to everyone who encounters you and finds that their framework stops working, that the relationship between how you live and what you're living produces in you is real, that choosing peace over bitterness is real, that releasing Good. You're here. Don't move. Don't blink. Because what I'm about to say isn't comfortable and it definitely isn't polite. But you didn't come here for comfort, did you? You came here because something inside you has been scratching at the walls of your skull like a caged animal that finally smells blood in the air. And you want to know why? You want to know why the same people who laughed when they broke you are suddenly whispering your name like it's a warning? You want to know why the room goes quiet when you walk in now? Why the same world that tried to bury you alive is starting to look at you like it dug up something it shouldn't have touched? Let me tell you something beautiful, something terrifying, something they'll never admit out loud. They crossed you, and in doing that, they accidentally woke something divine. Oh yeah, divine. Funny word, right? Sounds holy, sounds clean, sounds like white robes and golden halos floating in soft light. But divinity isn't always gentle. Sometimes divinity comes with claws. Sometimes it comes wrapped in scars and sleepless nights, and the kind of silence that makes weak people nervous because real transformation, the kind that changes a human being at the molecular level, it doesn't come from peace. It comes from pressure. It comes from betrayal. It comes from those long nights where you stared into the darkness and realized the person you used to be. The soft one, the trusting one, the forgiving one. That person died quietly while everyone else was busy laughing. You remember the moment, don't you? That moment when something snapped, not loudly, not dramatically. No thunder in the sky, no dramatic music. Just a quiet internal shift, like a lock clicking open in the back of your mind. And suddenly the pain didn't feel the same anymore. The insults didn't land the same anymore. The betrayal didn't break you the same anymore, because something inside you stopped asking, why would they do this to me, and started asking something far more dangerous. What happens if I stop being who they think I am? That's the moment they never saw coming. See, they thought they understood you. They categorized you, labeled you, put you in a neat little psychological box with a pretty little name on it. Harmless, predictable, forgiving, easy to manipulate. Oh, they loved that version of you. That version was convenient. That version could be stepped on and would still apologize for being in the way. That version believed the world was fair if you just stayed kind long enough. But then they pushed and pushed and pushed again, until something ancient inside your spine stretched its wings for the first time. Here's the paradox nobody tells you about human nature, the part that scares polite society so much they pretend it doesn't exist. Inside you lives both the saint and the psychopath, the angel and the demon, the healer and the destroyer. Most people spend their entire lives pretending the second half doesn't exist. They lock it away behind moral speeches and social smiles and little fake rules about who they're allowed to be. They pretend they're pure light while secretly rotting from the inside because half their soul is suffocating in a cage. But you didn't have that luxury anymore because pain did something interesting to you. It introduced you to yourself, that quiet rage you discovered, that calm surgical clarity you suddenly feel when people try to provoke you. That eerie composure you have now when chaos hits, that's not madness. That's integration. That's what happens when the angel finally shakes hands with the demon and says, "All right, enough pretending. Now, suddenly you're unpredictable and unpredictability." Oh, that's power. You see, the world is built on patterns. People feel safe when they think they can predict you. If they know you'll forgive, they'll betray you. If they know you'll stay quiet, they'll humiliate you. If they know you'll stay kind, they'll take advantage. But the moment you become unpredictable, the moment they're no longer sure whether they're dealing with mercy or judgment, everything changes. Because now every interaction with you feels like walking across thin ice. And they hate that. They hate it because they created it. They lit the fire themselves. Every lie they told about you. Every moment they underestimated you. Every time they pushed you down just to feel taller, it all stacked pressure inside you like gunpowder in a locked room. And one day, boom, not an explosion of chaos, an explosion of clarity. You stopped chasing validation, you stopped explaining yourself, you stopped begging to be understood by people who were committed to misunderstanding you. Instead, you evolved slowly, silently, beautifully, terrifying. Now look at them. Really look at them. The same people who once treated you like background noise are now studying you like a puzzle they can't solve. They watch your reactions more closely now. They replay your words in their heads. They analyze your silence like it's code hiding a message they're desperate to decode. Why? Because they sense something. They sense the shift. They sense the fact that you're no longer operating on the emotional leash they used to hold. You're calm now. And calm people are dangerous. Not loud anger, not screaming rage. No. That's easy to control. That's predictable. That's manageable. But calm fury, that quiet smile when someone expects you to react. That steady eye contact when someone tries to intimidate you. That's the energy of someone who has already survived the worst thing they can imagine. And people like that, people like you, they can't be manipulated the same way anymore. Because pain burned away the illusions. Now you see the games. You see the little psychological tricks people use to control each other. The guilt traps, the fake concern, the subtle disrespect hidden inside polite words, the quiet power plays disguised as jokes. You see all of it now. And the most terrifying part, you don't react the way they expect anymore. Sometimes you respond with kindness, so disarming it makes them nervous. Sometimes you respond with silence, so heavy it suffocates the room. Sometimes you respond with a calm truth so sharp it slices straight through their mask. That's the divine thing they accidentally woke inside you. Balance, not pure darkness, not naive light. Balance, the ability to choose who deserves your mercy and who deserves to meet the version of you that no longer flinches. That's what terrifies them, because they created a human being who is no longer afraid of their own shadow. And a person who accepts their shadow becomes impossible to control. You're not the same person they tried to break. You're something stranger now, something quieter, something sharper, something that smiles while seeing 10 moves ahead. And here's the cruel little joke of the universe. You didn't become this way despite what they did to you. You became this way because of it. Every insult was a hammer. Every betrayal was a chisel. Every moment of humiliation carved away the weak pieces of your old identity until only the core remained. Now what stands in their presence isn't the fragile version they remember. Now it's something refined by pressure, something calm in chaos, something capable of both forgiveness and destruction and wise enough to know when each one is appropriate. That's the thing about evolution through pain. It doesn't make you evil. It makes you awake. And once you're awake, you can never go back to sleep. So let them whisper. Let them wonder. Let them stare a little too long when you walk into the room. Because deep down, even if they can't explain it, they feel it. They crossed you. And in doing so, they didn't destroy you, they revealed you. They accidentally woke something divine inside a human being who now understands the oldest paradox in existence. The same fire that can burn the world can also light it. And now you finally know how to hold the match. Stay right there. Don't look away now, because the part we're about to talk about, that's the part most people run from. The part where you stop pretending the transformation was clean. The part where you admit something inside you didn't just wake up, it sharpened its teeth. See, the funny thing about people who cross you is that they always believe pain has only one outcome. They think pain turns people into victims, into quiet little ghosts who spend the rest of their lives limping around emotionally, asking the world for permission to breathe. They think when they humiliate you, when they corner you, when they laugh at your lowest moment, that you'll fold, that you'll shrink, that you'll slowly dissolve into the background like a mistake. Nobody remembers, but they never consider the other possibility, the rarer possibility, the dangerous one. That sometimes pain doesn't shrink a person, sometimes pain upgrades them. You see, most humans live their lives on autopilot. Soft routines, soft opinions, soft identities. They walk through life half asleep, half aware, following scripts written by other people. Be nice. Stay quiet, don't make waves. Forgive everything, smile even when you're bleeding. But pain, real pain, the kind that cracks your ribs open emotionally and makes you question the entire structure of reality. That kind of pain rips the autopilot right out of your chest, and suddenly you're awake. Pain forced you to look at the world without filters, no illusions, no comforting lies. You saw the games people play. You saw how fragile loyalty really is. You saw how quickly smiles turn into knives the moment you stop being useful. That realization alone changes a person forever, because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And the truth is this: people don't fear evil nearly as much as they fear unpredictability. Evil is predictable. Evil has patterns. Evil announces itself loudly. But unpredictability, that's chaos wrapped in calm skin. That's someone who doesn't follow the emotional rules anymore. That's someone who learned to observe before reacting. That's someone like you now. Look at yourself honestly for a second. Something about you has changed, hasn't it? You notice things you didn't notice before. Little shifts in tone, micro-expressions on faces, the subtle hesitation in someone's voice when they're lying to you. You read rooms differently now. You walk into a space and instantly feel the tension, the politics, the hidden hierarchies. That's not paranoia. That's awareness. Pain sharpened your perception like a blade dragged across stone. And awareness. Oh, that's terrifying for people who rely on manipulation to survive, because manipulators thrive in the dark. They thrive when you're emotionally predictable, when they know exactly which buttons to press to make you react. Anger, guilt, fear, sympathy. They study those emotional switches like engineers studying machinery. But the moment you stop reacting the way they expect, their entire system collapses. Have you noticed that? The confusion on their faces when you don't explode anymore? When you don't beg for explanations anymore? When you don't chase closure anymore? It makes them uncomfortable because silence is a mirror. And in that silence, they start hearing their own thoughts echo back at them. That's the divine thing inside you now. Clears throat. Not holiness in the fragile sense. Holiness in the ancient sense. The kind of presence that makes people suddenly aware of themselves. That calm intensity you carry now. That slow, controlled energy. It forces people to confront the parts of themselves they usually hide. And most humans hate that feeling. They'd rather deal with loud chaos than quiet truth. But you've become quiet truth. You walk differently now. Not physically maybe, but energetically. There's a steadiness in you, a grounded weight in your presence, like someone who has already faced the worst case scenario in their mind and decided they'll survive it anyway. And that terrifies people who rely on intimidation, because intimidation only works on people who fear losing something. But you already lost the illusion. You already lost the naive version of yourself that believed fairness was guaranteed. You already went through the emotional earthquake that forced you to rebuild your identity from the ground up. And once a human being has rebuilt themselves once, they realize they can do it again and again and again. That realization is power, not loud power, not the kind that screams for attention, but the kind that sits quietly in the corner of a room and somehow becomes the gravitational center of the entire place. That's why people look at you differently now. They can't quite explain it, they just feel it. Something about you doesn't bend the same way anymore. Not arrogance, not cruelty, just firmness like a steel beam hidden inside velvet. And here's the most delicious irony in this entire story. The people who crossed you, the ones who triggered this transformation, they still think they understand you. They still think the old rules apply. They think if they push the same buttons, you react the same way. But those buttons don't exist anymore, and they burned away. Pain melted them down. Now, when they try their old tricks, they're met with something unfamiliar. A calm smile, a curious tilt of your head, the silence so heavy it feels like gravity. And that's when the panic begins. Because humans are deadly uncomfortable when their mental map of someone stops working. They start asking themselves quiet questions. Why isn't this affecting them anymore? Why are they so calm? What do they know that I don't? And the most dangerous question of all, what if I misjudge them completely? That's when the shift happens. Respect starts creeping in where mockery used to live. Caution starts replacing arrogance, because now they're dealing with someone who understands both sides of human nature. You know the light. You know the darkness. You know the kindness that heals, and you know the cold clarity that ends nonsense instantly. You're no longer trapped in one identity. You're fluid. You're adaptive, and adaptability. That's the ultimate survival trait. Think about the most powerful forces in nature: water, fire, evolution itself. They don't rely on rigidity. They rely on adaptation, on constant adjustment. And that's what you became through pain. Adaptive. You can be warm when warmth is deserved. You can be merciless when boundaries are violated. You can be playful one moment and frighteningly serious the next. People can't categorize you anymore. And humans fear what they cannot categorize. That's why they're watching you now, quietly, carefully, trying to understand the new version of you that emerged from the wreckage they helped create. But here's the truth. They'll never fully grasp. You didn't just survive what they did. You absorbed it. You processed it. You refined it. Every insult became data. Every betrayal became insight. Every painful moment became another layer of psychological armor. You became a student of human behavior. And now when people interact with you, they're unknowingly stepping into a game where you already understand the rules better than they do. Not because you're cruel, but because you're awake. And awakened people are dangerous to systems built on deception. That's why they feel uneasy around you now. Because somewhere deep in their instincts they know They crossed you, they tried to diminish you, they tried to reduce you to something small, and instead they woke something ancient, something balanced, something divine in the most terrifying sense of the word. Not a saint, not a monster, something far more powerful than either. A human being who finally understands both and chooses which one to become, depending on who's standing in front of them. So now when they look at you, they're not sure whether they're looking at mercy or judgment. And that uncertainty, that beautiful, unsettling uncertainty, is exactly why they can't stop watching you. Listen carefully now, because this is the part where everything becomes clear. This is the moment where the fog lifts and the entire story rearranges itself in your mind. Not the version they told, not the version they wanted the world to believe. The real one. The moment you realize something almost poetic about all of this. They thought they were your ending, but they were just your ignition. Every person who underestimated you, every voice that tried to shrink you, every moment someone looked at you and decided you were easy to break. They were unknowingly participating in something much bigger than their tiny little intentions. They thought they were humiliating you. They thought they were controlling you. They thought they were shaping your limits. But pressure doesn't always crush things. Sometimes it creates diamonds and diamonds. Well, they cut everything. You see, the world has a strange relationship with transformation. People love the idea of growth as long as it stays cute, as long as it stays soft, as long as it fits their expectations. They'll clap for you when you improve politely, when you glow up quietly, when you glow up quietly, when you glow up quietly, when your success still keeps them comfortable. The moment your evolution starts to feel dangerous, that's when the whispers start. Something's different about them. They changed. They're not the same anymore. Of course you're not the same anymore. How could you be the version of you that existed before the betrayal, before the humiliation, before the sleepless nights where you had to rebuild your mind piece by piece? That version of you belonged to a different reality, a softer one, a more innocent one. But evolution doesn't ask for permission. Evolution happens when survival demands it. And somewhere along the way, during those quiet nights when the world thought you were broken, you were actually doing something much more interesting. You were studying people, studying behavior, studying the strange little contradictions that make human beings predictable. You noticed how quickly respect appears when someone stops begging for it. You noticed how silence can control a room more effectively than shouting. You noticed how the same people who once ignored you suddenly become curious when you stop trying to prove yourself. That's when the real power started growing inside you. Not the loud, childish kind of power that screams for recognition. The quiet kind, the terrifying kind. The kind that comes from understanding something most people never figure out in their entire lives. You don't control the world by forcing it. You control it by mastering yourself. Once you understand your emotions, once you can observe your anger instead of drowning in it, once you can hold pain in your hands and study it like an artifact, instead of letting it consume you, you become unshakable. And unshakable people are a nightmare for those who rely on chaos to control others. Think about it. Manipulation only works when someone can predict your emotional response. But you broke the pattern. Sometimes you respond with kindness that confuses them. Sometimes you respond with calm logic that dismantles their games. And sometimes you respond with nothing at all. And silence. Oh, silence is a beautiful weapon because silence forces people to sit with their own thoughts. It makes them wonder. It makes them question. It makes them question It makes them feel the weight of their own actions without you ever saying a word. That's the divine paradox. They accidentally woke inside you the ability to choose when to be light, to choose when to be shadow, to choose when to forgive, and when to walk away so coldly that someone suddenly realizes they just lost access to a person they never deserved in the first place.